Thou, marred by the flame of ambition, whose hand graspeth thy leash, I wonder? Or perhaps thy will is thine own? Tremble now with fear, for the hands of the fell omen will soon be upon thee to put out thy little flame.
So, quickly, just to address the question, why have a discussion about Morgott or use him as an anchor for a discussion? And I know when this game came out, I don't know about you, Casitive, but even to this day, people are so enamored with Ranni and Radahn and Malenia, and for good reason, and I was and am too. But of all the, I guess let's call them royal family members we meet in the game, Morgott has always stuck with me. And it could go back to maybe the closed network test and him being that mandatory main boss and that leaving a big impression on me. But I just sort of see him as like one of the more complex characters, definitely one of the more tragic characters. And I feel that to understand Morgott, or at least attempting to understand him, in doing that, you can really begin to understand Elden Ring and the Golden Order and the lands between. And yeah, he just feels like a really interesting gateway into this larger game world. Do you feel similarly at all, Casitive?
For sure. His threads go through so many different plot lines within the game that it is interesting that he does get overshadowed, even in like popularity, because it seems that that is kind of intentional. You have the monstrous grandiosity of Radahn, who's basically an armored core rolling around. You have Ranni, and who makes her grand entrance by just appearing at some points. You have all of the others who have these massive complexes, and then you have Morgott, who is one of the few that still have all of their faculties intact for the most part. You have Malenia, she's intact mentally, but she has no body. You've got Ranni, who's thrown away her body for reasons that are fairly complex, but they kind of overshadow everyone. And you definitely get that sense that Morgott has like lived in the shadow of his siblings, just as he does in the game, it seems. He seems a little bit bitter about that fact at certain points in the game. But his plot lines, the fact that he's an omen, the fact that he's the only one who is able to lead Lindell, the only one who has leadership of the Night Cavalry. He has his fingers in a lot of pies.
You know, as you were mentioning that he gets kind of overshadowed, that's like kind of unfortunately on brand for Morgott, because that's kind of his whole deal. And I was even thinking about it, like, I wonder if part of that overshadowing is that so many of the demigods, they very much resemble their parents, right? Radahn and Malenia very much resemble Radagon and the red hair, and Marika with Godwyn, and even Mikola to a degree with the blonde hair. And I think we become so conditioned to expect, even just down to hair color. And then Ranni, of course, like you said, she cast away her flesh, her actual corpse is up on her divine tower, but we know her as this sort of punk rock snow witch, so she really gets your attention because of her appearance. Whereas Morgott, he's kind of emaciated. He's an omen. He looks really haggard. You don't look at him and think, that's Godfrey's son. It doesn't click in the same way. So I almost think that's probably part of the overshadowing too. But do you want to talk just a little bit about where he falls in this family tree, and who his parents are, who his siblings are, and what the deal is?
Oh, right. His sibling is Mohg, who is a whole can of worms, or shall I say antlers. And, his family is Hoarah Loux, and when he was the Elden Lord and the king consort to Marika, there's some strange things there with regards to the parentage, considering that both Mohg and Morgott are omen, which is a whole separate discussion from their parentage, but like omens are super interesting in Elden Ring. For the most part, you see omen as these sort of massive but sort of pitiful creatures who have been shunned underground, but not too deeply underground, because if you go too deeply underground, you find a massive secret everybody's been hiding. But then you get the royal bairns, the talismans, and you start to see Mohg and Morgott in a sort of different light. Can we talk like real quick about that final scene between Hoarah Loux and Morgott? When you defeat Morgott, Morgott's omenness, is that a word? It is now, disappears. His horns have fallen off, and you get to see Morgott a little bit as who they were supposed to be.
Right.
And his hair is kind of gray-green, but it could have been blonde to match Marika and Hoarah Loux. And Hoarah Loux picks him up and seems fairly gentle with his son, whether or not he's really his biological son or just sort of an adopted son kind of doesn't really matter in that point. It is a gentle farewell to a child who served a nation in a country that threw him away.
Godfrey's sort of a construct, right? The real person is Hoarah Loux. And yeah, he has that really somber line where I think he says, Morgott, it's been too long. And yes. I think we're so used to, whether it's Marika, and she's certainly not in the running for Parent of the Year award, or you go to Sekiro with Owl, his treachery and his antics in that game. It's a pretty unusual moment to see, right, like you said, whether it's biological or not, a father cradling a child in one of these games. That's a pretty unusual scene. And then I think it's only then we see Morgott's grace sort of leave his body, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a deeply affecting scene, mostly because Morgott's entire boss fight is about expressing the pain and trauma that he's gone through. Literally, when he goes into second phase and he starts vomiting all over the place, his entire trauma is being expressed in that entire boss fight. And you defeat him, and then Godfrey shows up and he cradles this lost child who has done everything they could for approval that is never happening. Gwyndolin did it in Dark Souls, and Sekiro did it up into a point until he realized that he was being manipulated by Owl. Ostrava did it all the way to the end until he realized the lie he was being fed, if anything at all, and ended his own life in front of you if you go the total route. Or how it broke the two sisters of Ashia Dolman's children in Kuan, and how that destroyed their lives. So many fathers, it's usually fathers, mothers and mother figures are usually not present, which makes Marika a anomaly, actually, in From Software's meditation on parenting. Marika is like the first mother who, while she is a god, is actually sort of present in more ways than one. And it's interesting, too, that she and Radagon are the same person, because Radagon does fit the From Software mold for fathers, and that if Radagon's there, so is Marika. So Marika's the anomaly, but Radagon is sort of on brand. Usually other mother or mother-type figures in From Software games do not exist except in passing. They are ghosts in item descriptions, and that is it.
Right.
So that is very interesting. I mean, so many fathers in From Software lore are either devoured by their power and they lash out. Mothers, if they figure it all, they are like blessings in Dark Souls 3, but they're never there. And it's really interesting that Marika is sort of there.
Right.
And that kind of goes into some of the dualities that go on within Elden Ring. You get the mother has to exist with the father. The sons have to exist with the parents. Yeah, just swinging back around to Morgott, it's just a very affecting scene. There is this parent who, sort of like John Alfred Forrester in Kingsfield 3J, expresses sort of regret when their faculties are like, when they see the result of the trauma that they have given their children. And the result of the trauma that is expressed in Morgott's boss fight is his death. And with that death, his omenness, his trauma that is physically manifested in his horns are gone at that point. So that's very interesting.
No, absolutely. And it even gets me thinking with Hoarah Loux / Godfrey, you wonder if he was even on board with the subterranean shunning grounds and sending Morgott underground, because just like Morgott, it feels like was maybe not used, but a lot of characters are used. Marika used a lot of her family towards some end. And that includes Hoarah Loux, that includes Godfrey, that he was in her favor while he was conquering the giants and doing all these things. But then once he had exhausted his usefulness, he too was banished. So it even makes me wonder how on board he was with, I guess, a lot of things that were going on in this world, including, hey, I'm going to send my kid down into these shunning grounds. I mean, the alternative's cutting off his horns. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to send him underground. So yeah, very, very interesting. So what do you say we talk about the player's first encounter with Morgott in the game? That's something going on in Elden Ring, is there's a lot of aliases. He doesn't appear to us as Morgott. He appears to us as Margit the Fell Omen, as we're making our way up to Stormvale. First kind of legacy dungeon you encounter in the game. Vare, as you come out of the stranded graveyard, he tells you, yeah, this seems to be where the grace is leading you. You're a tarnished who lost your grace. The grace has returned to you. You can see the grace, and he encourages you, yeah, why don't you follow that up to Stormvale up there on the cliff? And when you get up there, Margit appears, but he appears in a pretty strange way. I remember during my first playthrough, or even in the network test, not understanding the significance, but when you see him sort of manifest out of that golden aura, felt like something interesting was going on there. Like maybe he wasn't physically there or something. Any thoughts about just this initial encounter, and maybe why it happens at all, like why he confronts us at this point?
So there's probably a few different ways you can view all of that. It is a warning. First and foremost, it is a massive warning. Look at what I can do. I can summon myself to this place because you tripped security system, basically. Although he hides the fact of his royal lineage through that alias, it definitely seems that he is trying to keep you away from like the events that happened within Stormvale Castle. He doesn't care about Godric. He cares more about Godwyn's presence within Stormvale, because one of the things that you can find within Stormvale is that, I only followed this correctly once, following the path laid out and that leads you down to Godwyn's big, massive mermaid face, the blood stain that shows our newish friend dying to Deathblight. And I think it is the Deathblight and this presence that Morgott is trying to keep us away from. Now that we're circling the drain here, this makes sense if Godwyn was the beloved son of Marika, because of how much Morgott is obsessed with upholding the legacy of his parents.
Right. I guess ironically, because of his stature in the world, he's like the best child. He does the best job as far as the order is concerned, and trying to uphold it and, live up to this ideal. He actually sort of does that. FromSoft always does a great job with environmental storytelling. And we know there's a lot of warfare going on at Stormvale, and you can see where areas in the sidewalls of the castle where it was just shelled, presumably from ships out in the sea, and you find corpses and swords and spears everywhere. But I even think it's probably not insignificant that the boss arena where we first fight Margit the Fell Omen has all of those spears and swords driven into the ground. Now, those could have been left behind by, again, soldiers who were fighting at Stormvale, completely unrelated to Margit. But we know that Morgott was kind of this badass during the Shattering, and he slayed a lot of, I think as the game puts it, heroes and champions. And I even wonder if those aren't literally maybe weapons left behind by other tarnished he's slain, other tarnished who maybe tried to head up to Stormvale and didn't make it through. It's maybe just symbolic in some way of his, maybe just like his intimidation factor and how dangerous he is and how ruthless he is. I don't know. That's just kind of a train of thought I had.
Yes. And some of those holes in the castle look like they are pushed out, not pushed in. The Deathblights are dead, and they look like they are trying to burst out of Stormvale Castle. Meanwhile, you have dragon like scratch marks across some of the areas of the castle. And like you said, the story trailer even shows us Morgott being an absolute badass. And as you said, that boss arena shows the intimidation factor, and it is a choke point. And it also shows how strategically minded Morgott, they've trapped you in this choke point. They're going to try to get rid of you. These are the remnants of other tarnished who have crossed his path.
He has that line, which was in the trailer. It's become quite famous since, about your flame of ambition. I think it's interesting, you hinted at this earlier, and we can get more into this certainly, but Morgott, because of his life, because of what he's endured, because of this sort of identity crisis, I guess, that he's dealing with, he has a lot of pent-up rage. He seems really spiteful, really resentful. He's got a lot of inner turmoil, and that's not the case when you think about it. When you encounter, not just in Elden Ring, but in like the Soulsborne games, it's not that common that you encounter like a really angry boss. He's not happy. You just sense like the spite and the resentment just dripping off of every word. And I think, did you have some further thoughts too on just that idea of ambition and maybe why that's such a sticking point?
Oh boy, ambition is a huge thing in Elden Ring. I'm going back to some of the pre-release material. Miyazaki stuck to the ambition points a few different times. Like, everybody has their own ambitions, everybody has their own goals. But we've also seen ambition in other From Software games, notably Sullivan in Dark 3, where his ambition has led him to, a lot like Morgott, be pretty much everywhere in Dark Souls 3. From becoming the pontiff of Irithyll to escaping the frozen wastes of the Painted World. That ambition to take over the lands within Dark 3 and to become the undisputed power within Dark 3. For a lot of people, I've heard Sullivan feels like he should have been the final boss. And so I guess that tracks, considering how many fingers Sullivan has in that pie.
We're almost, as the player, we're almost like retracing Sullivan's steps as we play the game, even down to like the profane flame. Like you said, even when he's not there, he's sort of this like specter over a lot of the game. And yeah, Morgott, definitely a parallel there with Morgott. Morgott actually reminded me a little bit of the Pursuer from Scholar of the First Sin, where you have this sense, it's like, this guy's following me. He's after me.
In the same vein as Nineball, in the same vein as the Pursuer. Pursuer is a direct reference to Nineball. Morgott is pursuing you, even if he's not physically the one pursuing you, with regards to the Night Cavalry, who will attack you obviously at night, at Morgott's behest. You're just rolling around the countryside, and all of a sudden, there's a Night Cavalry here ready to smack you one. He is pursuing you to keep you away from some certain uncomfortable truths of the lands between. And then the ambition, and it goes back to the dueling identities. Here is this Omen guy, and Omen people are usually thrown away, shunned away, but because of his royal lineage, he is elevated to some degree by throwing away that piece of himself that is that Omen, where Mohg did the exact opposite. Mohg threw away his elevated position as a princeling of Marika to try to revel in his omenness. If you look at Mohg lets one of his horns, go right into his left eye. Side note, that is the key to beating Mohg. If you are having trouble to beating Mohg, he's actually blind in one eye, much like Artorias actually, but I digress.
Yeah, but that's such a good point, right? Like, Mohg embraces his Omen nature. Morgott
does not.
Attempts to repress it and reject it.
Yes, both plans fail.
Yeah. I mean, I guess Mohg thinks that he's going to establish his own thing, a new dynasty. Whereas Morgott is like, no, I'll just uphold the old thing. I'll be the one to do that. And yeah, they both fail, like you said.
One thing that has taught me a lot about what From Software views is especially in their past games, especially in Elden Ring, is that balance is very important. Balance between light and dark is important, which is the takeaway of Kingsfield 4. You can't have one without the other. You can't be an Omen without getting rid of your humanity. You can't embrace your humanity and get rid of your omenness. You have to balance these two things together. And if you're not balanced between them, there is a turmoil because you are throwing away a piece of yourself, and that's never a good idea. You have to embrace all of it, or you will get subsumed into what happens to either Mohg and Morgott in turn.
I guess going back to the Omen part of this, my read on it was that the Golden Order and maybe the influence of the Greater Will, it seems to be just getting kind of, I don't know if fading is the right way to put it, but things are getting a little weird as of the time of the game. And maybe omens are beginning to exist as a byproduct of some kind of corruption within the order, or some kind of waning or changing of the influence of the Greater Will. It's so on the nose. They're called omens. They seem to be a harbinger of something bigger that's going on. I mean, it almost makes me think of, like, in Dark Souls 3, I feel like the main character of that game is really kind of the dying world. And there's just these signs everywhere that the world is atrophying and stagnating. And certainly the lands between are in a very different time and place than Lothric. But omens, they seem to be something that shouldn't be there, yet they are. And then they're being born to the goddess, presumably the goddess of the world. And then, the Barons, which you mentioned earlier, the flavor text tells us that most omen children, they have, I'm guessing because, there's a lot of human history around that, right? Like of deformed children or children with some kind of deficiency being discarded or even killed. And this seems to maybe be an interpretation of that in the world of Elden Ring, where a lot of these omen children, their horns, these grotesque horns, are being cut off. And in the process, most of them die. And the flavor text tells us that the royal omens, Mohg and Morgott, their horns weren't cut off, but they were still hidden away from the world down in the Shunning grounds.
This is something that I'm working on for a full essay, actually, in the moment. Are you familiar with Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code? It's a bad book, but are you familiar with it?
Yeah, on like a surface level, yes.
And the conclusion for that book is the Holy Grail is not actually a grail.
Right.
It's a womb. So the Crucible isn't a literal crucible, and I'm probably about to say some heresy, but the Crucible that the Greater Will only cares about is the womb of Marika. And just as a person will copy and copy and copy a VHS tape, and there's degradation every time you degrade a VHS tape, Marika's only worth to the Greater Will is her womb. And therefore she has to birth and birth and rebirth and give birth to different things, which is supported by some of the endings, the Mending Rune endings, because she is literally forced to give birth to the Duskborn, which is important. And as you mentioned, the Greater Will's influence is waning. But one of the things that might happen is as you mentioned, children are born with deformities. And this is also a world that looks to the heavens and to the skies, because this is the literal power, and sees that horoscopes are portents to the future and portents to omens, just like in the ancient times, where seeing a specific horoscope might say a flood is coming, or this is coming. Needless to say, in the world of Elden Ring, the planets actually do have power, and the planets are a sort of sapient presence in the world as well. Then you have omens who are being born. And then the omens are born of Marika, which is why I consider, and I believe, Morgott and Mohg are the last two who were born. And they are born with these deformities, which could be one of the reasons why Marika goes to try to shatter the Elden Ring anyway. If, and this is a huge if, because there is nothing in the game that says anything about this, if she is trying to save Mohg and Morgott from the influence of the Greater Will, because Elden Ring is a sci-fi game told through the lens of medieval and older peoples. If she is trying to save them from something or other because they are the ones born, and suddenly she has these omen children, then shatter the Elden Ring to allow death to reoccur, because you can't just keep birthing people out of the same person. It's not gonna, you have to go through menopause eventually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, and then the Crucible, I think about the arts of the Crucible, and And the first one that comes to mind is the Crucible Knight Horn attack. And when you
they're
look
all
at Morgott or Mohg, I think the first thing, I mean, yeah, they're big and kind of grotesque, but I think the first feature you notice about them are the horns.
it's all body horror. All the
Yep.
Crucible arts of war are body horror because the Crucible is the womb.
The game tells us that the Crucible is the precursor to the Erdtree.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a very interesting interpretation of that.
This doesn't absolve Marika. It's just a possibility because one of the biggest things that are really interesting about Elden Ring and what I've observed is that so many people have no abdominal cavities. They just don't have them. E.G. doesn't even have one. He has like a stone in place of his abdominal cavity. And the mending runes all take root at the root chakra / the womb of Marika in every ending that has the mending runes on it. This is the thing I think many people have missed with Elden Ring. Elden Ring seems to be much more about pregnancy and childbirth than people give it credit for.
Your first conclusion might be like, oh, okay, so maybe the Crucible was just this big giant melting pot that sat where the Erdtree sits today, and a bunch of stuff came out of it. And another read of that is, or the will is just using Marika for that purpose.
Yes.
Because I would say like the fact that she shatters the ring, which seems like a kind of crazy, desperate move on her part. And then the fact that we find her crucified on a rune inside the tree suggests being this vessel of the greater will is probably not a very desirable position to be in because things don't work out.
Absolutely
well.
not. Yeah. Absolutely not. The DLC even tells us that this is the place where Marika first stepped foot from whatever spaceship she showed up in.
Right.
Her womb would predate the Erdtree.
Yeah.
Like, period. It does fit.
I can't wait to find out, but you would think based on some of the Omen imagery we see in the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, and right, like you said, knowing that Miquella is essentially like following in Marika's footsteps in this realm, you would think we're, probably not going to have the complete picture maybe, but we're going to get some breadcrumbs. We're going to get something more about what's going on here.
Yeah, I mean, if you would adhere to some of the things I've said about Miquella and Saint Trina, with Saint Trina being used by Miquella to weaponize his own womb to rebirth him without the curse that kept him as a child, which is a crazy sentence to say, but it makes sense if you've played Elden Ring. What else has horns? Uterine horns. A lot of this is very viscerally feminine in a way that even Bloodborne isn't. Something went wrong, and Mohg and Morgott were born, which probably states that even royalty wasn't exempt from the omens coming to the lands between, because there was a lot of omen children. And one of the tableaus that we find in the Shunning grounds with the omen is that they are praying to feminine looking statues.
Yep.
They are praying to their mothers because they were probably children when they were thrown into the Shunning grounds. And again, the stars do have a presence within Elden Ring. They're not just stars. Having the greater will start to fade in this way is probably that omen. And people want to put their heads into sand when these omens are happening and try to blame things onto other people, such as the Dark Trilogy with the Undead Curse. The Undead Curse just shows up when the waning of the dynasty is starting, and people try to put their heads in the ground and try to ignore it, and they throw the cursed ones into the undead asylum.
Yeah, they round them up and send them to the Bastille or the undead asylum, or it's all very shameful and horrifying. I even think of like Lucatiel covering her face, very reluctant to show you what her face actually looks like. Yeah, this seems to be a very much like a brushing under the rug in Elden Ring of like, nope, you didn't see anything. Don't worry about that yet. When you get to the Altus Plateau, like outside of the capital, I mean, there's like omens have little camps, like they're just wandering around. Like you mentioned, Bloodborne, and that's what's interesting with From is that, especially in this Miyazaki era, you can tell which ideas interest Miyazaki most. That relationship between like children and fathers, or stagnation, or body horror. He and his team are like working through these ideas and interpreting them in different ways and fleshing them out in different ways in each of these games.
Right, yeah.
But there's so many through lines, there's so many patterns.
And it makes sense in that way that Morgott would be so vehement about keeping the status quo. I think he's the elder of the two. I don't know if you've read this article, but there's an article at The Atlantic about the, quote, plight of the eldest daughter, about how the eldest child really like has to mature a lot faster to help their parents with raising the younger children.
There's a burden. There's like an inherent burden.
Right. I wonder if Morgott is the elder of the two and took on the burden of leadership when Mohg dipped out and all of these other siblings dipped out to go do their own thing. I think that's totemized by the monologue that Morgott gives us right before his boss fight. He's standing around all of these empty chairs and he's like, look at all of these people who do not undertake their duties to make sure mom's seat remains warm. They all dipped out and I'm still here.
Yeah, he's very resentful, very much painting his siblings, these other demigods, as traitors and pretenders, like off on their own political agendas. And right, like, I'm here, I'm the dutiful one. And in a lot of ways, like, you kind of pity him. But at the same time, I suppose, not that I fault him much for it, but he's kind of a hypocrite himself because he has ambition and he has his own agenda. And it seems like in some ways he's trying to pretend like, no, everything's normal. With me, with the world, with the order, it's all good and we're keeping it together. But then I think, like you mentioned earlier, in the second phase of his battle, and I love when From does that, where story and the world and the lore and the gameplay really come together nicely. You really sense in that the main boss battle, not at Stormvale, but in the capital at the Elden Throne, he's processing all of his trauma and all of his inner conflicts throughout that boss battle. That's why he's so hyper aggressive. And like you said, he has this moment where his omen blood just pours out of him. He's been trying to hold it in and it just pours out in that second phase. And he becomes even more angry and even more aggressive and resentful. He's processing like who he really is and what was done to him and what's going on in this world. And he kind of knows it's all a sham. He knows like the tree is sealed. I don't know if he knows that mom's crucified inside, but he knows things aren't good deep down. And he's up until that point almost trying to pretend like, no, I got it under control. It's all good.
Right. So it's hard to know whether he knows what's going on with mom inside the tree. Trees and From Software. I mean, seriously.
I mean, even think about, like the old one is very tree-like and Demon Souls, the Curse-Rotted Greatwood in Dark Souls 3, right? It was this idea that they were basically just taking all the bad stuff and just putting it in the tree. We'll just store it all here.
There's a joke in my Discord server that if there's a tree in a From Software game, I've talked about it. It's hard to know whether Morgott knew what happened to his mom. He's just trying to hold everything together. He is just trying to parent all of these people who refuse to be parented, and he's really mad about it. And then in his second phase, as you mentioned, he has to let his omenness in a little bit to even have an attempt to killing this tarnished one in particular. He has to open up he has to like break open his cane to get his really cool sword, by the way.
That's become like one of my favorite weapons in the game. That's a really fun weapon to use.
Real fun.
And it just looks so unlike any sword really that I can think of in any of their games. It's such a unique asset in the game.
It's definitely a sci-fi sword.
Yeah.
It's definitely a sci-fi sword.
Yeah.
And just like him, he has to open up that sword because it was aliased as a cane the entire time. He didn't even use it the first time that he fought you because he underestimated you. He thought that you were just one of those other tarnished I've probably killed in the past. But this time, when everything is on the table right in front of the Erdtree, he has to unveil what this cane actually is, and it's actually a sword. He has to let that omenness in, and once you let that omenness in, even just a little bit, that's it. This is a break in case of emergency happening.
There's an interesting parallel there with his second phase and Godfrey / Hoarah Loux's second phase, where it's like you're seeing the real version of them in that second phase, and it's even in the same exact arena. I love how they do that. I never mind when things are just done because it's a video game and we're doing it for video game reasons. That's fine. I like video games. I like playing video games. It's all good. But it is exciting and it's intriguing when they're able to actually explain like a boss's stronger second phase in this kind of way, that it's not just like, oh, you got their health bar half the way down, let's make the challenge harder. It's that with those two characters, again, father and son, you're now dealing with their true form, their true nature. And that's pretty cool.
Amazing little storytelling for Morgott and the Omen in particular. I forget which divine tower it is, but you do fight another another pair of Omen twins.
Morgott's tower outside of the capital.
Is that
to get to it, you have to fight those two omens in the darkness. Yeah.
Right. I forgot whether that was Morgott's or Mohg's, but like, yeah, and that's an eerie mirror to both Morgott and Mohg in and of themselves. If they
because there's two of them.
Yes. If they had done something different, if they were slightly different, if they were not royalty, this is who they would be. This is who they are. The Divine Towers usually tell us the truth in a certain way.
Yeah, like with Ranni as well, her corpse being at the top of her tower.
And all of these fingers being fossilized at the top of the tower. There's hidden truths on top of the Divine Towers. As you mentioned, Ranni, her corpse is on the top of the Divine Tower. She murdered her flesh there and became a spirit. We find at certain divine towers, there are Godskin apostles who are there to fight you. And Morgott's tower, we find two Omen twins in the dark, in the abyss, because it's not just dark, it's just black. For all of the trappings, all of the royalty, all of the stuff that they pretend to be, this is who they are.
Yeah. Well, and it's like even then, because you're on your way to the consecrated snowfield and you've already defeated Morgott, in some way it's almost like he's still meddling with you, where it's like you thought you were done with this and now I'm fighting two omens. Yeah, he's just everywhere in this game world, it feels like. And like omens are everywhere, and the horns and the body horror. And I always enjoy sifting through this stuff because I think otherwise you can be like, oh man, why do I have to fight two of these guys? I just want to get to this tower. But I think as you begin to understand what the development team was thinking when they placed those two enemies there, it can enhance your experience with the gameplay. It's like,
right,
this is why I'm dealing with two omens here.
Like we've come across the Omenkillers here and there, and they're just as terrible. The Omenkillers could warrant their own thing. They wear masks that make mockery of Omen. They make mockery of Morgott.
Those double serrated melee weapons. I mean, they're literally wandering around to kill Omen children.
And which is funnier and ironic. Funny in not a haha way, but funny in the ironic way, in that Omenkillers are essentially physicians who have had way too much drugs. All they are, after a fashion, are killers. Just like Vare, he's a physician ostensibly. It seems like the game is sort of saying these physicians, if you give them enough of a nudge, they're mostly just murderers.
In this capital city, where Morgott is actually serving as the game puts it, the veiled leader, because he's being secretive about his identity, that in that same city, there's just Omenkillers roaming around looking for
him. Yeah. For him in a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
It says something to maybe the hysteria about the omens. It maybe says something to the paranoia and the fear that occurred because these omens were being born more and more as the greater will's own strength was waning, and the stars were stating, this is happening now. You cannot ignore it. But people try to ignore things all the time.
Yeah, I love that word hysteria. That does seem to be what it is. Like, I think because Elden Ring is such a massive game, there's so many boss encounters, there's just so many locations and moments that you can almost forget about this encounter and gloss over it a little bit. But when you're making your way up to Morgott at the Elden Throne in the capital, you're almost there. But when you get to the Erdtree Sanctuary, suddenly there's this golden aura, much like there was when you first see Margit, and a projection of Godfrey appears. And at this point in the game, like if you're a new player, this is your first playthrough, you've heard so much about Godfrey, but he's not present. You don't really know where he is. You don't really know what happened to him. And now suddenly there's this projection of Godfrey, this golden projection in front of you, who you have to defeat to get to Marika's bedchamber and then the Elden Throne where Morgott is. My read on that was that we were talking about earlier, Morgott in ways is trying to almost pretend like everything's okay. Like, nope, I got this. I'm ruling. The order's good. We're holding things down. I got it. I feel like maybe in a way, the projection of Godfrey here is maybe a little bit of that. Like, oh, look, it's Godfrey. Everybody loves Godfrey. He was this great warrior of the Golden Order. He was the Elden Lord. But then it's probably also, again, Morgott just trying to stop you in your tracks, like testing your mettle again. Why won't this Tarnish just die?
You know what's funny about that moment is that Ranni does the same thing.
Yes. Yes, with Rennala.
Because Renala is basically chilling, sitting in her bassinet. She is not mentally able to do that second phase. That is Ronnie.
You even hear Ronnie's voice.
Doing that second phase. And it's apples and trees, they don't fall very far from each other, apparently. But like, Morgott's doing the same thing. This is my dad. My dad was super, super powerful. My dad will kick your ass. Here's my dad. He's going
my
to
dad will beat up your dad.
Yeah, my dad will beat up your dad.
That's really sad in a way that, like, it just makes me feel even more sad about Morgott, though, when you think about it that way. Like, he clearly idolizes Godfrey. You know, when we hear these stories about him during the Shattering, like just slaying all these champions and heroes, and we have to contend with it when we fight him ourselves. He's clearly got a lot of Godfrey in him. Or Hoarah Loux, rather, like in terms of being this resilient warrior. Morgott's got a lot of that.
Yeah, and his sword is even a curved sword, which is probably not super native to a lot of the lands between, other than maybe Hoarah Loux, who comes from the Badlands.
Yeah, that's a good call. Couldn't believe that bit of concept art where during the Shattering, Morgott is on top of Radahn, beating down Radahn. From is not throwing that concept art at you arbitrarily. They are showing you, when they build up to Radahn, like Radahn and Malenia were basically the two strongest demigods, yet they're giving us a piece of concept art showing us that Morgott could hold his own in battle against even Radahn, which is really saying something.
Morgott is not a pushover. The critical path through Elden Ring the first time, if you don't in your like second and third games, just kind of bypass Stormveil entirely, because you can pretty much ignore everything up until Lindell, actually, if you play your cards right. But there's also that encounter in the battlefield, which is, you know, he's puppeting some rando aristocrat. I think it's an aristocrat from the garb anyway.
Yeah, and again, that's like that kind of pursuer, like you're saying, like that pursuer sort of 9-ball vibe. Like, he's not letting you pass. He's tracking you. He knows where you are. He's not relenting. And I'm guessing, like, as this veiled monarch, he probably did a lot of this. You're probably not the first Tarnished to have to deal with this guy in this kind of way, but you're probably the toughest. You're exceeding his expectations for sure. To the point where he almost, like you said, he like kind of panics and it's like, here's my dad.
Here's my dad. I mean, where do we find the mimic veil? In a dining room in Stormveil Castle. Yep. So it's probably not just that he is figuratively the veiled monarch, but he was probably literally veiled under mimic veils.
Well, and it's so interesting when you think about the physical spaces leading up to that boss battle with Morgott and the significance of them. You get into the Erdtree sanctuary and it's like, oh, here's my dad, deal with him. But of course, Godfrey's not really there. And then the next chamber is his mother's bedchamber. Of course, she's not there. And then you get up to the Elven throne and there's all these other thrones for the demigods. And of course, they're empty and it's just him alone.
And he doesn't have one for himself, and he's supposed to be a monarch,
No, and he can't claim the Elden Ring or become Elden Lord himself. The tree's sealed. He knows it deep down. He's, again, trying to pretend like everything's fine. Oh, it's just so tragic. And they've, obviously From has done whether it's Sad Knights or just these villains who aren't really villains, like antagonistic characters who, like Genichiro, right? Like if you play Sekiro the first time, you kind of think like, okay, this guy's the main antagonist. But depending on your perspective, like you can kind of sympathize with Genichiro. You can kind of pity him and understand like where he's coming from and what's motivated him to do what he's doing. And I don't know, though, that tragedy has ever been more pronounced than with Morgott. He's just,
It's so interesting, too, because it's like there are villains, but they're not villains. They're antagonists. I think the only villain who approaches villain status is Sullivan. Right. But he clothes his villainy in religion a lot of the time. But there is no perspective to learn about Sullivan that makes you go, he could have been right if he did something a little bit different, or he could have been right in certain ways. Whereas Genichiro is a person who was trying very hard to fit the role that he had stumbled into because he is adopted. Like, you can figure out why Genichiro is the way that Genichiro is, and you can do the same with pretty much all of the demigods in Elden Ring. Even Radahn, like Radahn is a monster at that point, but he is a monster who cannot let go.
I was thinking too, because you brought up Sullivan again, there certainly are some similarities between Morgott and Gwyndolin, and I think for a lot of us who are fans of these games and been playing these games for years, Gwyndolin is like one of those characters you just kind of keep going back to, just one of those really, really standout characters in the Dark Souls trilogy. And they're certainly alike in the sense that they didn't seem to be loved for who they truly were.
Mm-hmm.
And despite that, or maybe in spite of that, maybe because of that, like an overcompensation, they took up this mantle of trying to preserve things or keep things together. And in that were very tragic characters. You really kind of pitied them and what they had to endure. Do you have any thoughts on that, like similarities or dissimilarities between Morgott and Gwyndolin?
I love Gwyndolin. I think the symbolic thing there is that makes that me nod emphatically with what you just said is the bouquet of flowers that is on top of Gwyn's tomb when you defeat Gwyndolin. Gwyn's tomb is right there, and it's flowers, and it's in Dark 1, it's in Dark 3. Like the same bouquet of flowers is still there. These are two people who wanted, at least in Gwyndolin's point of view, wanted the love of Gwyn, and Gwyn wasn't about to really give that, wasn't equipped to give that away, considering my read of Dark 3's ultimate finale is that Gwyndolin was the one who veiled the ringed city. And so Gwyndolin was in part responsible for giving away his older sister. Gwyn saw tools, and when those tools were not useful, Gwyn tossed them or sold them to the pygmies.
Gwyndolin in Anor Londo, which is no longer the Anor Londo of old. Dad's not around. Dad is a hollow at the kiln. Yet Gwyndolin is trying to keep up appearances and act like everything's okay. And in their mind, trying to do the right thing and probably seeking the approval and the love that they didn't get.
Yeah,
and I feel like that's so similar with Morgott in Leyndell.
For sure, because you have the Nameless King, and Gwyndolin was there for the Nameless King, and the Nameless decided to try to make his own thing because you're not a carbon copy of your parents. And the Nameless King was the ultra male in that family, the prince, the successor to Gwyn's legacy. But Gwyn's legacy was Gwyn's and not Nameless's. Gwyn wanted to maintain that legacy. There would never be a succession because these people were supposed to be immortal. So these princes would never succeed Gwyn. Gwyndolin wanted that affection that was never coming to them. Nameless had that affection, and he was thrown away as soon as Nameless decided to try to do something different. Morgott wanted that affection from his mother, and I'm not sure if there's anything that says it, if Morgott knew that Marika was also Rad Dad.
Right.
He could have, because he acknowledges at least Radagon's children. Here's this one person who wanted that love, who was probably shunned and probably didn't seem to, or didn't feel like they were given that love, much like Gwyndolin, because of something that was totally out of their control. Gwyndolin was born under the moon and thus put into a specific role. And Morgott, born under terrible horoscopes and was a omen of the ending of the current era and was shunned for it also. And that's very, very on brand for From Software and their meditations on parenting and parentage.
Very much so. I think that's why that final scene under the burning Erdtree with Godfrey cradling Morgott's body, it surprised me so much that they went there. It tells you a lot about Hoarah Loux as well. And that's why it kind of makes me think like either maybe he wasn't on board with the whole Omen shunning ground business, or even if he was, like, he deeply regretted it.
Or he definitely wasn't on board with being thrown out of the lands between. If we consider what's going on, what was going on and what Hoarah Loux's actual role was, is Godfrey was the acting monarch of Leyndell, while Marika was now Radagon, doing Radagon things elsewhere. And as soon as Godfrey couldn't maintain or hold the lie anymore and had to leave because the grace was leaving Godfrey, Rad Dad had to come back, transition back into Marika, and do what she ended up doing. one thing that's interesting about when you meet Godfrey at the start of his boss fight is that the grace isn't just leading you to him. It is actually pointing Godfrey at you. So he was on his own journey back into the lands between. He probably regained his grace, and that allowed him to come back into the lands between. And he was trying to find us too. And at the end, at that one scene, you see that the grace is pointing him at us rather than the other way around.
What you were saying about his time as ruler, it's just interesting that both he and his son ultimately ruled under false pretenses.
Mm-hmm.
Godfrey is, because you hear so much about him, and then when you finally meet him, even after he removes Siraj and you face him in his true form, even after you defeat him, he doesn't put you down. A lot of FromSoft bosses, if they have any parting lines, they're still kind of talking smack even after you beat them. And Hoarah Loux doesn't do that. I think he actually gives you props. He says something like, your strength befits a crown.
Right.
So it's like from that to being able to sympathize with him as a Tarnished and being on a very similar journey to you, to the way that he embraces Morgott at the end. I was a pretty big Hoarah Loux fan by the end of the game, and I didn't expect things to play out that way. I didn't expect necessarily we'd even meet him in person, but we do.
Yeah, I didn't expect to meet him. I figured he would end up being one of those Velka type figures that people speculate and never get an answer about.
Morgott, spurned by the grace of gold, a true warrior thou art. Thy rest is well deserved.
Well, Casitive, thanks again so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking the time out of your weekend. And
thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here and to chat about Elden Ring, which is one of my favorite subjects.
Hey, likewise. I feel like that's one of the truly amazing things about the FromSoft community. Just the excitement and the passion about the games alone is enough to bring people together. Like one person just being like, hey, do you want to talk about this one character from this one game? And the other person's like, oh yeah, absolutely. That's pretty normal around these parts.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want me to ramble on incessantly into the night, a la Mikolash, you have come to the absolute right place. So,
yeah, maybe we can do this again sometime. Maybe after the DLC comes out, and I'm sure there's going to be no shortage of stuff to comb over. And oh man, I can't wait.
Oh, I cannot wait. I already put in my pre-order.
Yep.
I am super hyped. Can't wait.